I have something important to share. She is my maid.
The first time Dominic Ashford introduced me to someone at a party, he called me our housekeeper's daughter. I was standing beside him in a navy wrap dress I had ironed that morning, the same hands that ironed his collar, the same hands I was now pressing together behind my back so no one would see me shaking. The man across from us, a silver-haired shipping magnate named Gerald Voss, looked at me the way people look at a coat rack. Functional, forgettable. Gerald shook Dominic's hand for a long time. He never shook mine at all. I smiled because that is what I had learned to do. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, because if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the person who was supposed to see you most clearly, this story is for you. Stay close. What happens in the next 40 minutes will change everything. My name is Alara Voss Trentholm. Not that you would know it from the way I lived for the 18 months I was married to Dominic. I met him the way people meet people when they are trying very hard not to be who they are. I had come to London on a private arrangement, not a holiday, not a gap year, but something I can only describe as an escape attempt. I was 26. I had just ended a 7-year relationship with a man named Callum, who had loved me precisely and only because of what my name meant. The moment I had understood that, truly understood it, in the way you understand something in your chest before your brain catches up, I had asked my grandmother for 1 year of ordinary. My grandmother had given me 18 months. She had set me up with a modest flat in Islington, a cover story, and one condition: come home when you are ready, not before. She was the only one who understood why I needed to go. She was also, though I did not know it then, the only one keeping the world from following me. Her name was Her Majesty Queen Adeline of the House of Voss Trentholm, sovereign of a small European principality that had somehow retained both its monarchy and its dignity through 2 world wars and 3 democratic revolutions. And I was her granddaughter, her only granddaughter, the one whose photograph sat on every government building between the mountains and the sea. But in London, I was just Alara. Alara with the 2nd-floor flat and the part-time job at the Community Literacy Center and the Thursday habit of leaving tins of food on the steps of the Islington Food Bank because the volunteer coordinator had once told me they were always short on Thursdays. I met Dominic at the Literacy Center. He had been roped into a corporate volunteer day by his firm. He was charming in the way expensive things are charming, compelling, well-maintained, designed to attract. He laughed at things I said. He remembered details. He brought coffee without being asked. I fell for it. I want to be honest about that. I fell for it completely. We were married 11 months later in a small register office ceremony. I wore my grandmother's locket, a narrow gold oval engraved with the royal crest on the back, which I always kept turned inward against my skin. I told him it had been my grandmother's. I told him she lived abroad and was not well enough to travel. Both of these things were true. What I did not tell him was that 300 miles away, in a palace with more rooms than most villages, my grandmother was watching our wedding live stream on a tablet held by her private secretary and crying in a way that queens almost never allow themselves to cry. Subscribe now if you're already rooting for Alara, because I promise you, what's coming will be worth every second. The shift in Dominic was not dramatic. That is the thing about this kind of cruelty. It doesn't arrive all at once, like a storm. It seeps in, like damp. 3 months into our marriage, he started introducing me differently at work events. My wife, Ilara, she volunteers. The pause before volunteers was barely perceptible, but I perceived it. I had grown up reading rooms. You learn that when rooms contain diplomats. 6 months in, it was, Ilara's very community-minded, said to the wife of a hedge fund partner with a smile that was aimed at her and not at me. 9 months in, at his firm's anniversary dinner at the Grand Emerald Hall, He forgot to introduce me at all. I stood beside him for 40 minutes while 4 colleagues came and went, and not one of them was told my name. I eventually extended my own hand and said, "I'm Alara, Dominic's wife." The colleague, a man named Piers with a cufflink problem and a very loud blazer, looked genuinely startled as though a decorative plant had spoken. I called my grandmother that night, not to tell her, just to hear her voice. "Are you happy?" she asked, the way she always asked, which meant, "Are you still sure this is what you want?" "I'm still sure," I said, which was no longer entirely true, but which I needed to keep being true for a little longer. "Alara," her voice was gentle but specific, "you are not required to earn your dignity back from someone who stole it. You were born with it." I held the locket in my palm after we hung up and did not sleep until 4 in the morning. The night that broke everything open was the Ashford Industries charity gala at the Windsor Pavilion in La Jolla. Dominic's family had organized it. His mother, Constance Ashford, who wore her wealth the way some people wear armor, and his father, Edmund, who had the handshake of a man who had never once doubted himself, and the business ethics of someone who had never needed to. The gala was a fundraiser in name. In practice, it was a 300-person audition for social relevance. I wore a simple champagne silk gown. I had done my own hair. I had borrowed nothing from anyone. Dominic had looked at me when I came downstairs and said, "You look fine," and walked to the car without holding the door. I should have known then, but I was still trying. We arrived at the pavilion at 7. The chandeliers were doing their job magnificently. The whole hall was lit gold and ivory, and the hum of 300 voices doing 300 calculations of net worth was almost musical. I stayed close to Dominic. I kept my hand near his elbow without touching it, the way you hover a hand near a flame to test if it's still burning. It was around 8 o'clock when Constance Ashford found us. She was wearing midnight blue and a smile that had been surgically maintained. She had brought with her a woman called Frederica Blaine, the kind of woman who reviews restaurants with the phrase, "charming for what it is," and a journalist from a society column whose name I never caught, but whose recorder was already running. "Dominic, darling," Constance said, kissing the air beside his cheek, "the Hartleys are asking for you at the east balcony. The Harbor Commission vote is in 3 weeks, and Marcus wants to get ahead of it." She turned to me. The smile did not change. "Ilara, you look—" The pause was precise. "Comfortable." Then she turned to Frederica Blaine. "You must have met Ilara before. She helps out around the house. Marvelous with the linens, apparently." The journalist's pen moved. I felt the locket press against my sternum. Dominic said nothing. "I want you to understand the specific silence of what happened next. Not the silence of a man who didn't hear. Not the silence of a man deciding what to say. It was the silence of a man who had decided, in advance, that this was acceptable. The silence of a man who had weighed his wife's dignity against his mother's approval and returned a verdict before the scales had even finished moving. He turned toward the east balcony. "Yes," he said, to his mother, not to me. "Let's go find Marcus." And they walked away, all 3 of them. The journalist glanced back once, not with malice, but with the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned to record humiliation without flinching. I stood in the center of the grand pavilion in my champagne silk gown, surrounded by 300 people who had not seen what had just happened to me. And I made a decision. I walked to the coat check. I retrieved my phone from my small silk bag. I dialed a number I had not dialed in 4 months. It rang once. "Alara?" My grandmother's private secretary, James Whitfield, answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting, which meant she had told him to wait. "James," I said, "tell her I'm ready." A pause, then quietly, She'll be very glad to hear that, ma'am. Ma'am. I had not been called that in 18 months. How long? I asked. She anticipated your call, James said. The convoy is already in San Diego. 45 minutes. I went back inside. I took a glass of sparkling water from a tray. Not champagne. I wanted to be very clear-headed for this. And I found a chair near the window that looked out at the harbor. And I sat, and I waited, and I watched the lights on the water. Don't miss what happens next. If this story has you gripping your phone right now, subscribe. The next part is going to leave you breathless. The convoy arrived at 43 minutes. Those of you who have never seen a royal motorcade from the outside, not in a parade, not behind a barrier, but arriving purposefully at a location that was not expecting it, cannot fully imagine what it does to a room. It began as sound. First, the motorcycles. 6 of them, in pairs, lights flashing not frantically but steadily, with the calm authority of something that has never once had to hurry because nothing has ever dared to be late for it. The sound reached the pavilion before the lights did, and people near the windows turned, the way people always turn when something immovably powerful is approaching. Then the vehicles, 7 of them, black, long, bearing small flags at the bonnet that were not British, not American, but carried a crest that several people in that room recognized immediately because it had been on the front page of the Financial Times twice in the past year during trade negotiations. The vehicles pulled up in a formation that was not accidental. They did not park. They positioned. The pavilion's music, a string quartet performing Elgar, stopped mid-phrase. 300 conversations died in sequence, like lights going out in office windows after midnight, one floor at a time. I set down my glass of sparkling water. The main doors of the Windsor Pavilion opened, not by the staff, but by 2 men in navy ceremonial uniform with gold braiding at the shoulder and white gloves and the measured, deliberate posture of people trained to make entrances feel inevitable. Between them, 3 steps behind, walked James Whitfield in a morning coat, holding a portfolio under his arm and moving with the quiet urgency of a man who has done this on 4 continents. He stopped at the center of the room. He did not use a microphone. He did not need one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and the room was so silent that his voice reached the window alcoves and came back again. "Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Ilara of the House of Voss-Trentholm, heir to the sovereign throne, requests the courtesy of your attention." I stood up. The silk of the champagne gown moved as I crossed the floor. I had not changed. I had not needed to. I had walked into this room as myself, and I was still myself. And the only thing that had changed was that now everyone knew it. I watched Dominic's face from across the room. He had been holding a glass of whiskey. The glass was still in his hand. He had simply stopped being the person who would think to set it down. His mother, Constance, who had called me comfortable and marvelous with the linens, had gone the specific color of someone who has realized, in real time, that they have made a very serious error of calculation. The journalist recorder, I noticed, was still running. James Whitfield reached me and gave a small bow. "Your Royal Highness, the convoy is prepared whenever you wish to depart." "Thank you, James," I said. "Give me 10 minutes." He stepped back. The guards formed a quiet perimeter, not threatening, not aggressive, simply there, in the way that mountains are simply there. I walked toward Dominic. He met me halfway, which I thought was something, and then I realized he was doing it because the people watching would find it harder to hear us at distance. He was still calculating. He would be calculating until the end. Ilara. His voice was low and controlled. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him for a long moment, not to perform the pause, but because I genuinely wanted to remember his face as it was right now, before my answer settled into it. "Tell you what, specifically?" I said. "That I was a person worth introducing? That I had a name worth saying at dinner? That I was your wife and not the housekeeper's daughter and not someone who was comfortable and marvelous with the linens. I kept my voice very even. You didn't ask me who I was, Dominic. You decided who I was. The first week we were together, you decided, and you never revised. That's not fair. At the Grand Emerald Hall dinner, I said, you let 4 of your colleagues come and go without saying my name. I timed it. 40 minutes. I watched him absorb this. Tonight, your mother told a journalist that I help out around the house, and you walked away. I paused. You walked away. He opened his mouth. I'm not angry, I said, which was the truest thing I had said all evening. I want you to understand that. I'm not here to humiliate you in front of your family's donors, because that would make me the thing your mother always implied I was, someone without grace. I'm here because I made a phone call, and I am leaving, and I wanted to say this to your face so you cannot later tell yourself I disappeared without explanation. Constance had appeared at Dominic's shoulder. Her voice was several degrees lower than it had been earlier. Your Royal Highness, if there has been any misunderstanding— There hasn't been, I said pleasantly. You said what you meant. You always did. I simply no longer require the building you set it in. I turned to Dominic one final time. I genuinely hoped, I said quietly, that you had seen me. The version of me that showed up every Thursday to the food bank and stayed late at the literacy center and learned the names of your colleagues' children so you wouldn't have to. I hoped that was enough for you to want to know what else I was. I touched the locket at my collarbone, just briefly, one finger. It wasn't. That's all right. But I'm not going to keep paying the price for your lack of curiosity. I turned. James Whitfield was already moving to my side. The guards adjusted their perimeter. The doors were held open. Subscribe if you want to see the rest of this through, because we are almost at the part where justice stops being poetic and starts being real. The consequences were not ones I engineered. I want to be precise about this, because the story is less satisfying if you believe I reached back and pulled strings. I didn't. I had made a phone call, asked for a convoy, and left a gala. The rest was gravity. The journalist, her name was Sophie Caldwell, I learned later, and she wrote for a publication called The Atlantic Circuit, which covered wealth, society, and the people who moved between them, had filed her piece by midnight. She had not, to her credit, sensationalized it. She had simply reported what she had witnessed. A woman introduced as domestic help at a charity gala, followed 43 minutes later by a royal motorcade, followed by an announcement, followed by a departure. The piece was titled, "The Crown Princess They Called the Maid." It ran with a photograph of me crossing the pavilion floor. Silk gown, locket, not looking back. It had 4 million readers by morning. By noon the following day, 3 members of the Ashford Industries Board had issued statements distancing themselves from the incident. 2 had done so, I was told, before their lawyers could advise them not to. The charity at the center of the gala released a statement thanking all attendees and conspicuously failing to mention the Ashford family by name. The Hartley Group, whose Harbor Commission vote Dominic had gone to court, quietly redirected their legal partnership inquiry. Constance Ashford called the palace. Twice. The calls were received by a junior secretary who expressed that Her Royal Highness was not currently available and offered to take a message. No message was left. Dominic called my personal line 14 times in the 48 hours after the gala. I read each notification and put the phone down. On the 15th call, I asked James to respond on my behalf, with a brief, formal note that said I had retained counsel and would be in contact through them. I was not cruel in this. I was simply finished. What Dominic lost in the months that followed was not, in the end, something I caused. He lost it the way buildings lose their foundations, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a slow withdrawal of the things that had been holding them up. Business partners who had tolerated his family's social aggression because of their connections reassessed. Social invitations became less frequent. The Ashford name, which had been a comfortable weight in certain rooms, became a complicated weight in the same rooms. None of this was my design. I was, by then, home. Home is a complicated word when you are the heir to a sovereign throne. The palace was smaller than people imagine, or perhaps I mean more human. The courtyard where I had learned to ride a bicycle still had the same worn cobblestones. The room my grandmother used for informal meetings still smelled of the particular blend of tea she had drunk every afternoon of my life. The window in my bedroom still looked out over the same ridge of pines and the same blue strip of sea below them, constant and indifferent and beautiful. My grandmother met me in the small sitting room, not the formal one. She was wearing a cardigan. She had been waiting. She held my face in her hands for a long moment before she spoke. "I watched the video," she said. "The crossing. The doors. James chose the convoy size, not me." "I know. I told him 7 vehicles minimum." She released my face and sat back, and looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for things she found both painful and correct. Was it as hard as it looked? I thought about it honestly. "The 43 minutes of waiting," I said, "were harder than the crossing." She nodded. "The waiting always is." We had tea. We talked for 3 hours, about Callum and what I had understood about him, and about myself, about Dominic and what I had chosen to see, and what I had chosen to overlook and why, and the difference between being naive and being deliberate about hope. About the 18 months, which had given me things I had not expected, a real understanding of what it felt like to be invisible, which is, I told her, something every person who will one day hold power should experience, because power that has never understood invisibility is power without compassion. She listened without interrupting, which was the greatest gift she could have given me. When I had finished, she refilled my tea and said, "You know what comes next." I did. The formal resumption of royal duties, the public calendar, the press conference, the photograph that would be released through official channels, not the one Sophie Caldwell's outlet had already published, though that one had, in its way, done its own work. "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I thought about the locket. I had been wearing it turned inward for 18 months, crest against skin, plain gold face outward, unremarkable, hidden. That morning, for the first time, I had worn it the right way around. "Yes," I said. "I think I've been ready for a while." 6 months later, at a state function in the palace's main hall, the one with the portraits and the marble floors and the chandelier that my grandmother always said was too large, but had never replaced because it had been a gift from the Belgian royal family in 1923, I was formally presented to visiting dignitaries as Crown Princess Ilara, heir to the sovereign throne. I wore white. I wore the locket. I wore the specific expression I had been working on since the night at the Windsor Pavilion, the one that is neither triumphant nor apologetic, but simply present, simply here. A diplomat from Brussels shook my hand and said, "Your Royal Highness, I understand you spent some time in London recently." "I did," I said. "And what did you find there?" I thought about the literacy center and the food bank and the 43 minutes by the window, and Dominic's silence and the string quartet stopping mid-Elgar, and my grandmother's cardigan, and James Whitfield's steady voice in a room full of 300 people who had all stopped counting each other's net worth for 40 seconds to simply look at a woman crossing a floor. "Clarity," I said. "I found a great deal of clarity." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Dominic remarried 2 years later. I read it in a brief social column. A wedding in the Scottish Highlands, small ceremony, private guest list. I did not feel what I thought I would feel, which is perhaps the best evidence that I had genuinely moved forward and not merely moved away. I wished him, in my private and sincere heart, exactly what he deserved. Not happiness he hadn't earned, but the chance to earn it, if he chose to try. That is, I think, the truest form of mercy. Not the erasure of consequence, but the door left slightly open, the possibility, extended freely, of being something better than what you were. Constance Ashford never called the palace a third time. The Ashford name recovered, modestly, over several years, enough to matter to them, not enough to matter to anyone who had been watching. Edmund retired, the board stabilized. The world, as it tends to do, moved on. Here is what I want to leave you with, because every story that is worth telling has something inside it that is true beyond the specific people it happened to. The people who reduce you to a function, housekeeper, helper, accessory, backdrop, are not wrong about you. They are wrong about what matters. They have built their entire sense of safety on a hierarchy that they did not create and cannot sustain. And when it shifts, as it always shifts, they are not wicked so much as they are profoundly unprepared. That is not an excuse. It is, perhaps, an explanation. The two are different. You do not need a royal motorcade. You do not need a herald or a convoy or a hall full of witnesses. You need only the knowledge, quiet and internal and genuinely held, that your worth exists independently of whether anyone in the current room has the sense to perceive it. My grandmother told me this when I was 9 years old. She told it to me again when I was 26, and running from a man who had loved my title more than myself. And I am telling it to you now, because these stories travel, and I do not know whose window they come through, but I know that somewhere tonight, someone needs to hear it. You were not made for their approval. You were made for your own becoming. If this story found its way to someone who needed it, share it with them directly. And if you want to stay for the next one, because there are more stories where this one came from, about dignity and patience and the slow, magnificent business of coming home to yourself. Subscribe. We'll be here. Drop in the comments. Has anyone ever underestimated you, and what did it teach you? I want to read every one.
Drop in the comments. Has anyone ever underestimated you, and what did it teach you? I want to read everyone.